venturing well beyond the surface-level details often repeated about his short reign. We will incorporate additional historical context and delve into the political, social, and religious upheavals of the period to highlight how this young king, often overshadowed by his more infamous father and sisters, was integral to the fabric of Tudor England. Throughout this account, you will see references to the complex interplay between court factions, the overarching influence of the Protestant Reformation, and the unique challenges posed by a child king with a volatile temperament. Edward was born on October 12, 1537 in his mother's chambers inside Hampton Court Palace, in Middlesex. History portrays Edward VI as the feeble and ultimately doomed son of Henry VIII, but the truth is far darker than that. Far from a weakling, even as a boy Edward proved nearly as twisted as his rotund father, and his gruesome end was likely a blessing for England. The birth of Edward VI was probably the greatest moment in Henry VIII's life. The rotund king desperately wanted a son, but it took 28 years, 2 daughters, and 3 wives to finally make it happen. People were beyond excited. One chronicler described the infant Edward as the most beautiful boy that ever was seen. However, tragedy soon marred the joyous occasion. Queen Jane Seymour couldn't celebrate alongside everyone else. It became clear her labor had taken a serious toll on her. Within days, she was hanging by a thread. Seymour fought for a little over a week before succumbing to her illness. Edward VI never got to meet his mother, and let's just say the boy definitely needed all the motherly guidance he could get. Edward VI basically grew up without a father, too. Sure, Henry VIII was over the moon that he finally had a son, but that didn't mean he was actually going to spend any time with the boy. Henry sent Edward away almost from the moment he was born and, aside from one brief visit when Edward was 1, he almost never saw him for the first several years of his life. During that time, Edward fought for survival. At 4 years old, he caught the deadly quartan fever. All of England likely held its breath, wondering just how dark Henry VIII would get if the son he'd waited so long for suddenly passed. In the end, Edward recovered, and he grew up to be one of the biggest spoiled brats the world has ever seen. Sure, Henry didn't actually spend time around Edward, but he still spoiled him rotten. He called his son this whole realm's most precious jewel, and Edward's attendants treated him accordingly. When Edward turned 6, his entire life changed, because, believe it or not, the Tudors believed a child became an adult at the age of 6. Edward finally got to move in with his father, and their relationship quickly took a turn for the weird. Henry had workers completely remodel Edward's rooms so they looked exactly like his own. He also had Edward's entire wardrobe replaced with smaller versions of his own clothes, apparently hoping Edward would turn out just like him. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Henry made Edward study like any other boy, but he made sure his son studied in style. Edward's school books were completely covered in gold and set with sapphires, rubies, and diamonds. His lunch breaks were equally opulent. He ate with jewel-encrusted cutlery and used napkins threaded with pure gold and silver. And like a lot of overly privileged kids, Edward picked up some disturbing hobbies. Among his mountains of toys sat a sinister red box filled with tools for sorcery. He and his older sister Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, both had a strange obsession with magic and astrology. Family Henry VIII's desperate quest for a male heir is one of the central dramas of English history. By the time Edward was born, Henry had already executed one wife, Anne Boleyn, and had set aside another, Anne of Cleves, in a humiliating manner. Queen Jane Seymour's brief success in birthing a prince was overshadowed by her subsequent death, leaving Edward the single tangible symbol of Henry's paternal hopes. Edward's half-sister Mary, much older and initially the king's only surviving legitimate child, had endured her own traumatic experiences. She was declared illegitimate when Henry annulled his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, her mother. However, Mary and Edward's early bond underscores how personal relationships within the Tudor family were often overshadowed by politics. In a typical household, Edward might have clung to Mary for maternal affection, but as both grew older, and especially as Edward's Protestant zeal hardened, sibling affection gave way to religious and political enmity. Meanwhile, his other half-sister, Elizabeth, shared a complicated connection with Edward. They both possessed sharp intellects and, as we heard, a mutual fascination with astrology. Historians have pointed out that Elizabeth's early experiences under Henry's unpredictable rule, and Boleyn's execution, Elizabeth's own loss of legitimacy, made her wary and politically astute. It's worth noting that Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr, played a notable role in Edward's, and Elizabeth's, intellectual life. A well-educated woman with strong Protestant sympathies, Catherine Parr oversaw the formal education of both children. She even published works on religion, something nearly unheard of for a queen at that time. Through her, Edward may have developed an even more pronounced zeal for Protestant doctrines. Beyond Catherine's guidance, Edward also studied under the esteemed scholar John Cheek, whose rigorous curriculum in Latin, Greek, and theology placed the young monarch at the forefront of humanist learning. Manuscripts from the period bear traces of Edward's studious nature, complete with annotations that reflect not only his linguistic fluency but also a growing sense of divine entitlement. Cheek and other tutors reinforced the idea that Edward's role was divinely ordained to drive the final wedge between England and what they deemed the superstitions of Rome. As a result, the king's passion for Protestant reform became tightly interwoven with his academic pursuits, creating a heady blend of intellectual ambition and fervent spirituality that would leave a lasting imprint on his reign. From Mary's viewpoint, Edward was the favored heir of a father who had broken her mother's marriage. She had reason to resent him, yet she still cared for him at first. Later, when Edward's policies clamped down on Catholic observances, Mary's defiance put both siblings in an awkward standoff. This tension only grew throughout Edward's reign, setting the stage for Mary's subsequent swift actions once she herself took the throne. Career, reign as king. When Henry VIII died in 1547, England was left in a precarious position. The country was still reeling from the dissolution of monasteries, the transformation of religious practices, and the lavish spending on wars that Henry had left behind. Edward's accession to the throne at 9 years old placed real power in the hands of a regency council. The Lord Protectors and factional politics Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, as uncle to the king, seized a golden opportunity to become Lord Protector. The Regency Council that Henry VIII had envisioned was quickly cast aside when Seymour convinced or bribed other nobles to grant him nearly absolute power. Seymour's rule was marked by costly campaigns in Scotland, often referred to as the rough wooing, where he tried to force a marriage between Edward VI and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. These military campaigns drained the treasury and caused domestic discontent, especially among farmers who suffered from economic upheaval. Despite being occasionally painted as a more moderate Protestant compared to Dudley, Seymour proved ruthless in eliminating threats to his power. Yet he also displayed a certain naivete in political maneuvering, which John Dudley later exploited. John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland, was a shrewd politician. Once Seymour's popularity declined and a power vacuum emerged, Dudley capitalized on the king's ear and the court's frustrations. Under Dudley, the Reformation accelerated in England. He aligned himself with strongly Protestant bishops like Nicholas Ridley and further marginalized Catholic practices. Dudley's regime was not without fault, but he proved more adept at balancing the books than Seymour. He ended some of the costly wars, albeit through concessions that were humiliating to national pride. Somerset's social policies during his brief tenure as Lord Protector, Edward Seymour initially fashioned himself as a champion of the commoners, at least in appearance. He set up commissions to investigate the rampant enclosure of common lands, a practice that enriched wealthy landowners at the expense of farmers and laborers. These moves earned Seymour the nickname the Good Duke among some subjects, but also provoked fierce resistance from the gentry who felt their economic interests were under attack. The resulting tension culminated in uprisings like Kett's Rebellion in 1549, where the grievances of displaced villagers boiled over into open unrest. While Somerset's concern for social issues seemed progressive for the era, his inability to balance popular expectations with noble interests ultimately weakened his grip on power, paving the way for more adept rivals to seize control. Economic strains and popular discontent. Despite the official narrative centering on religious reform and dynastic politics, mounting economic woes loomed large during Edward VI's reign. Rampant inflation, fueled by the ongoing debasement of the coinage, eroded the purchasing power of common people and stoked widespread resentment. Agricultural enclosures, where wealthy landowners fenced off once shared fields, further escalated tensions, displacing small-scale farmers and laborers. This economic squeeze turned simmering grievances into outright rebellions, as seen when frustrated citizens took up arms to protest rising rents and dwindling wages. Although the royal council tried to temper these crises by suppressing unrest, the heavy-handed tactics often backfired, intensifying the public's discontent. In this charged atmosphere, even well-intentioned social reforms could spark social upheaval, leaving the young king's government in a precarious balancing act between appeasing the elite and pacifying the aggrieved masses. Religious policy under Edward VI's fervent Protestantism was stoked not only by his father's break with Rome but also by the circle of reform-minded tutors and courtiers around him. One of the most significant outcomes of Edward's reign was the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer, first in 1549, then in a revised, more Protestant form in 1552. Edward's severe stance against Catholicism, seen in his treatise Attacking the Pope, showcased a teenage king who believed he was on a divine mission to stamp out superstition. Catholic Mass, veneration of images, and certain sacraments were increasingly restricted or banned. Many historians argue this period laid the foundation for future religious conflicts under Mary I and Elizabeth I, because the shifts were abrupt and forced upon a population that was still divided in its religious loyalties. Foreign policy chaos. Scotland, the rough wooing, Henry VIII's plan to unite England and Scotland through the betrothal of Edward and Mary, Queen of Scots, disintegrated when the Scots refused to yield. This refusal triggered a brutal campaign, 1543 to 1551, that further embittered Scotland. Besides, England's historical rivalry with France flared up again, and Dudley's eventual peace deal, where Edward was betrothed to Princess Elizabeth of Valois, was indeed humiliating. It underlined that England's finances and military might were stretched too thin to sustain prolonged warfare. Edward's personal involvement. While Edward was only a child, numerous surviving documents suggest he took a keen interest in governing once he was old enough to understand the intricacies. He wrote journals, annotated prayer books, and held debates on religious matters. These behaviors suggest that, had he lived, Edward may have been a forceful and possibly tyrannical ruler in his own right, especially given his unyielding religious convictions and the cruelty hinted at by both his personal actions and certain eyewitness accounts. Scandal. The Tudors are synonymous with court scandals, and Edward's reign did not lack them. The major players, Edward Seymour, Thomas Seymour, and John Dudley, saw the king's youth as their golden ticket to ultimate power. Yet the manner in which these uncles and advisors jockeyed for influence reveals just how deeply personal ambition was intertwined with national policy. If Edward Seymour pursued a more official route to power as Lord Protector, Thomas Seymour opted for cloak-and-dagger schemes. His attempt to marry Princess Elizabeth was daring enough, given that marrying a royal without the council's approval was a treasonous act. But his ultimate plan to abduct King Edward was the stuff of a melodramatic novel. Thomas's miscalculation lay in expecting familial loyalty from Edward Seymour. Tudor politics rarely left room for sentimentality. Thomas's intrusion into the king's bedchamber was not only foolish but signaled an almost delusional arrogance. Shooting the guard dog that barked at him sealed his fate, ensuring he couldn't slip away unnoticed. The story highlights how fluid and dangerous royal favor could be. Even the king's uncle, if perceived as a threat to the state's stability, or to the regent's own grip on power, could be dispatched with chilling efficiency. Thomas Seymour's execution was a precursor to Edward Seymour's own demise. Once an ally and a father figure to Edward VI, Edward Seymour lost the support of the young king, or at least lost the ability to counteract John Dudley's cunning moves. Dudley accused Seymour of mismanagement, ambition, and failing the country, charges that resonated with a weary council. The tragedy of Edward Seymour's downfall underscores the broader theme of kill or be killed that haunted Tudor governance. Loyalties were ephemeral, and every perceived misstep could be used as a pretext for a coup. Even the protectors needed protecting in a world where the crown's authority was vested in a minor, and where every nobleman dreamed of pulling the puppet strings. With Edward Seymour out of the way, John Dudley consolidated power, effectively becoming the next Lord Protector. Under Dudley's stewardship, scandal often took the form of rapid policy reversals, ending wars, forging new alliances, and intensifying the Protestant Reformation. While these maneuvers may not read as scandalous in the same dramatic sense as an assassination plot, they were seen by many at the time as betrayals of Henry VIII's legacy and humiliations of national pride. Tensions rose not just in the court but among the populace, who faced economic strain and religious confusion. Dudley's need to maintain Edward's favor in religious affairs forced him to support or even encourage the king's more radical impulses, setting England on a collision course with Catholic dissenters and paving the way for future unrest. Marriage in 16th-century Europe, royal marriages were powerful tools of diplomacy, forging alliances, ending wars, or at times igniting them. For Edward, marriage negotiations began almost from his cradle. The effort to wed him to Mary, Queen of Scots, was part of Henry VIII's ambition to unite England and Scotland under one monarchy. When the Scots refused, it turned into a pretext for the brutal rough wooing, an ironic moniker for a campaign that was anything but gentle. Later, the prospect of marrying Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of King Henry II of France, had the potential to curb hostilities with France. Yet, Edward's failing health cut these plans short, leaving an incomplete tapestry of what might have been. If either marriage had been successful, the entire trajectory of England's foreign relations, and perhaps even the Reformation's course, might have been different. It's worth noting that even after Edward's death, the concept of forging alliances through marriage remained a cornerstone of Tudor foreign policy. Mary I's controversial marriage to Philip II of Spain would prove deeply unpopular, while Elizabeth I deftly used the promise of marriage as a diplomatic bargaining chip without ever finalizing a match. Other relationships. Edward VI's relationship with his siblings was complicated. At first, he doted on Mary, and he shared an interest in sorcery and astrology with Elizabeth. But as he became more extreme in his Protestant views, he turned against Mary, who was a devout Catholic. Eventually, his relationship with Elizabeth also cooled. Edward also had a series of powerful men vying to control him, first his uncle Edward Seymour, then John Dudley. Both used the young king for their own ambitions, causing chaos in England and anger among the populace. The death of Edward VI in July 1553 remains a watershed moment in Tudor history. His demise not only triggered a short-lived experiment in placing Lady Jane Grey on the throne but also solidified the precarious nature of religious reforms in England. Let's break down the final days and the immediate aftermath in greater detail. In an era before antibiotics, a childhood bout of measles could be lethal or at least debilitating. Edward's doctors struggled with limited knowledge. Mercury, lead-based concoctions, and bleeding were common treatments, many of which only weakened him further. Tuberculosis remains the most commonly suggested cause of death, as the symptoms align with Edward's slow physical decline. Chronic coughing fits, night sweats, and the wasting away of body tissues were observed in his final weeks. Contemporary rumors of poisoning reflect standard Tudor paranoia. Whenever a monarch or key figure died unexpectedly, opponents were quick to claim foul play. However, no credible evidence ever surfaced. Edward's death was, in all likelihood, the grim result of disease exacerbated by the era's rudimentary medical understanding. As Edward lay dying, the question of who would succeed him loomed large. According to Henry VIII's will, Mary I was next in line. But Edward, deeply Protestant, could not bear the thought of a Catholic queen undoing his religious reforms. Under the influence of John Dudley, Edward drew up the device for the succession, naming his cousin Lady Jane Grey as his successor. This move was fraught with legal and popular legitimacy issues. Lady Jane Grey was indeed of royal blood. Her grandmother, Mary Tudor, was Henry VIII's sister, yet bypassing Mary and Elizabeth was blatantly contrary to established inheritance laws. The council that supported Lady Jane Grey was dominated by Dudley's faction, which was deeply unpopular, especially among those who wanted either Mary or Elizabeth to maintain Henry's line. Upon Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. The scale of Mary's support, however, was underestimated. Many commoners and nobles alike saw Mary as Henry's rightful heir. Her dramatic rallying of supporters in East Anglia, where she was widely supported by local gentry, shifted the balance of power. Dudley's scramble to contain Mary failed, and within days, the coup collapsed. Jane Grey was deposed, Mary claimed the throne, and Dudley was executed. Jane's brief reign ended tragically when Mary, seeking to solidify her own position, ordered Jane's execution, underlining how quickly Tudor favor could turn. Edward's attempt to maintain a Protestant succession thus backfired, accelerating a reactionary Catholic swing that would define Mary I's reign. Edward's early death froze his legacy in adolescence. The falcon anecdote, where Edward allegedly tore a living bird apart, could be propaganda by enemies seeking to blacken his name. Yet, eyewitness accounts of his temper remain. Considering the brutality with which Tudors often ruled, it's entirely plausible that Edward, had he reached adulthood, would have become a monarch with Henry VIII's temperament and a Calvinist-like determination to impose uniform religion. In that sense, his death may have saved England from a reign of terror akin to or even surpassing Henry's darker days. In the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, England swayed back to Catholicism under Mary. But once Mary died, Elizabeth took the crown, reinstating Protestantism in a more moderate form. The zigzag of religious policy under these successive monarchs can be traced, in large part, to the foundations laid during Edward's time. His introduction of the Book of Common Prayer and other Protestant measures gave a strong institutional footing for the Reformation. Even Mary's Marian persecutions couldn't erase that entirely. By Elizabeth's reign, Protestantism was enshrined deeply enough that it would become the long-term national faith. Hence, Edward's ephemeral presence on the throne created a ripple effect that defined the next half-century of English religious life, and, by extension, set the stage for centuries of religious tension in Britain. Indeed, Puritans of the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras pointed back to Edward's policies as the godly standard. For them, Edward was the boy king who might have delivered a more thorough reformation had he not been cut down by fate. And there you have it, the startling truth behind Edward VI's short life and ominous end. Though he wore the crown for only a few years, his impact on England was anything but insignificant, thanks to his extreme beliefs, manipulative advisors, and dangerous temper. In the end, this spoiled son of Henry VIII proved that sometimes the greatest threat to the throne can come from within it. If you found this exploration insightful, please remember to like, subscribe, and check out our channel for more revealing dives